They told you American history was clean, heroic, and simple. They lied. Behind the textbooks are secrets so shocking, so uncomfortable they were quietly skipped in school. If you think you already know U.S. history, these facts will completely flip it upside down. Before we start, hit subscribe, because history gets way crazier the deeper you go. For generations, one of the most persistent myths taught to American schoolchildren has been that George Washington had wooden teeth. It is a tidy, almost charming detail, easy to remember, harmless, even a little humorous. But like many comforting myths in U.S. history, it quietly replaces a far more disturbing reality. The truth is that George Washington did not have wooden teeth at all, and the real story of his dentures opens a window into slavery, wealth, medical practices, and moral contradictions at the very core of early America. Washington suffered from severe dental problems from a young age. By his early 20s, he had already lost several teeth, likely due to a combination of poor dental hygiene practices common in the 18th century, genetic predisposition, and the limited medical knowledge of the time. Dentistry as a professional field barely existed. Tooth decay, abscesses, and infections were common, and extractions were brutal, painful affairs often performed without anesthesia. By the time Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States in 1789, he had only one natural tooth left in his mouth. Because Washington was one of the wealthiest men in colonial America, he had access to dental care that was completely out of reach for ordinary people. He employed skilled dentists, including John Greenwood, one of the most prominent dentists in early America. Greenwood crafted multiple sets of dentures for Washington over the years. These dentures were sophisticated for their time, made using carved ivory from hippopotamus or elephant tusks, cow teeth, metal springs, lead, and, most disturbingly, human teeth. Human teeth were commonly used in dentures during the 18th century. Dentists believed they fit better and looked more natural than animal substitutes. But these teeth did not come from willing donors in any ethical sense. In many cases, they were purchased from the poor, from grave robbers, or from enslaved people. Records show that Washington himself bought teeth from enslaved individuals he owned. In a surviving ledger entry from 1784, Washington documented a payment for 9 teeth on account of Negroes, a chillingly casual phrase that reveals how normalized the commodification of enslaved bodies had become. For enslaved people, selling teeth was not a free choice in any meaningful sense. Enslavement stripped individuals of autonomy over their labor, their families, and their bodies. Even if payment was technically recorded, refusal was rarely an option. Teeth extraction without modern anesthesia was excruciating. The pain would have been immediate and severe, and the risk of infection high. That the future father of the nation knowingly benefited from this system forces a reckoning with how deeply slavery was woven into everyday life, even into the physical body of American leadership. Washington's dentures were not comfortable or cosmetic marvels. They were heavy, awkward, and painful. The ivory warped over time as it absorbed moisture, altering the fit and pressing painfully against his gums. Metal springs forced his mouth open, meaning Washington had to consciously clench his jaw to close it. This caused constant soreness and affected the shape of his face. Contemporary portraits showing Washington with a tight-lipped, strained expression are not simply artistic choices. They reflect the physical discomfort he lived with daily. These dental problems affected Washington's speech as well. He struggled with pronunciation and often felt embarrassed when speaking publicly. Letters from those who interacted with him mention his self-consciousness about his appearance and voice. This discomfort adds a human dimension to Washington, but it also underscores the irony of a man celebrated for eloquent leadership, while privately enduring pain that was, in part, made manageable through the exploitation of others. The myth of wooden teeth likely emerged decades after Washington's death. ivory dentures sometimes stained or cracked in ways that resembled wood grain, and over time, storytellers simplified the truth into a child-friendly anecdote. The wooden teeth myth sanitized the past. It removed slavery, suffering, and exploitation from the story and replaced them with something quaint and harmless. This is not an accident. American historical memory has often favored myths that comfort rather than truths that disturb. What makes this story particularly unsettling is not just that Washington used human teeth, but that he was fully aware of the moral contradictions of slavery. In private letters, he expressed discomfort with the institution and acknowledged its injustice. Yet throughout most of his life, he continued to enslave hundreds of people, benefiting from their labor, bodies, and enforced silence. His dentures are a physical manifestation of that contradiction, liberty proclaimed with a mouth quite literally supported by slavery. It is important to understand that Washington was not unique among wealthy elites of his time. Human tooth dentures were common among the upper class in Europe and America. Enslaved people and the poor were seen as biological resources, their bodies mined for labor, reproduction, and even body parts. Teeth, hair, skin, and bones were commodified. What makes Washington's case stand out is not that he participated in this system, but that he has been elevated as a near-mythic symbol of American virtue, often without confronting these uncomfortable truths. This raises broader questions about how history is taught and remembered. When textbooks repeat the wooden teeth myth, they are not just getting a detail wrong, they are participating in a tradition of historical softening. By omitting the role of enslaved people in this story, the narrative avoids forcing students to grapple with the human cost behind America's founding figures. It allows national pride to exist without accountability. Understanding the real story behind Washington's dentures does not require rejecting his contributions entirely, nor does it demand simple moral condemnation. Rather, it asks for honesty. History becomes more meaningful, not less, when its heroes are seen as fully human, capable of leadership and vision, but also complicit in injustice. The goal is not to replace one myth with another, but to accept complexity. Washington eventually freed the enslaved people he personally owned in his will, making him the only major founding father to do so. This fact is often cited as evidence of moral growth. Yet even this act came after a lifetime of benefit from slavery, and it did nothing to erase the suffering already endured. The teeth taken from enslaved people were never returned, never acknowledged, and never named. Their identities are lost to history, absorbed into the legend of a man whose smile was presented as wooden and harmless. The physical reality of Washington's dentures also reminds us how closely the personal and political are intertwined. The body of the first president was not separate from the system he helped govern. Slavery was not an abstract economic structure operating somewhere else. It was intimate, immediate, and personal. It fed him, clothed him, maintained his household, and even filled his mouth. When people say, "That was just how things were back then," the dentures challenge that defense. There were always people who knew slavery was wrong, enslaved people themselves most of all. Pain, coercion, and exploitation were understood clearly by those who suffered them. The fact that elite society normalized these practices does not make them morally neutral. It makes the system more revealing, not less. Re-examining myths like the wooden teeth story is not about tearing down history, but about deepening it. When students learn the real origins of Washington's dentures, they are forced to ask harder questions. Who gets remembered, and who is erased? Whose pain is minimized for the sake of national comfort? What other harmless myths are quietly covering uncomfortable truths? The story of Washington's teeth endures because it is symbolic. Teeth are intimate. They are part of how we speak, eat, and smile. To learn that enslaved people's teeth were taken and placed into the mouth of a man hailed as a symbol of freedom is deeply unsettling, and it should be. Discomfort is often the first step toward understanding. In the end, the wooden teeth myth says more about modern America than about Washington himself. It reveals a desire to preserve innocence in national storytelling, especially when that innocence comes at the cost of truth. The real history is messier, darker, and far more human. And it is precisely because of that complexity that it deserves to be told honestly, without sanding down its sharp edges into something as false and as comforting as wood. One of the darkest and least discussed episodes in American history unfolded not on a battlefield or in a foreign war, but quietly in hospitals, morgues, and tenement apartments across the United States. During Prohibition, the U.S. government deliberately poisoned alcohol consumed by its own citizens, fully aware that the policy would maim and kill people. This was not an accident, not a rogue operation, and not an unforeseen consequence. It was a calculated decision, justified as a necessary deterrent in the federal war against drinking. Thousands died anyway. When the 18th Amendment went into effect in 1920, it banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages in the United States. The goal, at least on paper, was moral reform. Supporters believed alcohol was the root cause of crime, poverty, domestic abuse, and moral decay. Remove alcohol, they argued, and society would naturally improve. What they failed to anticipate, or chose to ignore, was that Americans did not stop drinking. Instead, alcohol went underground, spawning bootleggers, speakeasies, organized crime, and an enormous black market that made criminals wealthy and the government desperate. Alcohol did not disappear during Prohibition. It transformed. Industrial alcohol, used legally for manufacturing paints, solvents, perfumes, medicines, and fuels, became the backbone of illegal liquor production. Bootleggers learned how to renature denatured alcohol that had been chemically altered to make it undrinkable, by filtering or redistilling it. This alcohol was then sold to millions of Americans who either could not or would not give up drinking. The federal government quickly realized that it could not stop this flow through enforcement alone. Raids, arrests, and seizures barely slowed demand. Faced with widespread defiance, government officials made a chilling choice. Instead of simply discouraging consumption, they decided to make drinking dangerous. The U.S. Treasury Department ordered that industrial alcohol be deliberately poisoned with increasingly lethal chemicals. The logic was brutally simple. If people kept drinking illegal alcohol and died as a result, others would be scared into sobriety. Death, in this framework, was a feature, not a failure. At first, denatured alcohol already contained substances like kerosene, gasoline, or bitter compounds designed to make it unpleasant. But when bootleggers successfully removed those additives, the government escalated. They approved formulas that included methanol, also known as wood alcohol, a substance that is highly toxic to humans. Methanol can cause blindness, organ failure, and death, even in relatively small amounts. When metabolized, it turns into formaldehyde and formic acid, attacking the nervous system and vital organs. Officials knew exactly what methanol did to the human body. This was not scientific uncertainty. Medical literature had documented its effects for decades. Doctors repeatedly warned the government that people were dying horrible deaths, vomiting, convulsing, going blind before suffocating or slipping into comas. Morgues filled with victims whose only crime was drinking what they thought was alcohol. Newspapers reported spikes in unexplained deaths, especially during holidays when drinking increased. Instead of stopping, the government doubled down. By the mid-1920s, the formulas used to poison industrial alcohol became even more lethal. Additional toxins were added to make redistillation harder and the alcohol deadlier. Internal memos and public statements reveal a disturbing indifference to human life. Officials argued that anyone who drank illegal alcohol was knowingly breaking the law and therefore responsible for the consequences. In their view, the victims were not innocent civilians, they were criminals who deserved what happened to them. This reasoning collapsed under even minimal scrutiny. Many victims were not hardened criminals or gangsters. They were working G-class Americans, immigrants, laborers, and poor families who had limited access to safe alternatives. Wealthy Americans continued to drink legally prescribed alcohol, imported liquor, or stockpiles purchased before Prohibition. The poor drank what was available. The poison did not fall equally. It targeted those with the fewest choices. Doctors across the country protested. Medical associations condemned the policy, calling it unethical and murderous. Hospital staff watched patients arrive in waves, blind, delirious, dying, and pleaded for intervention. They warned that no public health policy could justify knowingly poisoning citizens. Their warnings were ignored. Perhaps the most damning aspect of the program is that it failed at its stated goal. People did not stop drinking. Consumption dipped briefly, then rebounded. Addiction, habit, social pressure, and despair proved stronger than fear. Many people did not even know the alcohol was poisoned until it was too late. Others knew and drank anyway, believing they could avoid harm by drinking less, filtering the liquor, or trusting bootleggers' claims of safety. The death toll climbed steadily. Conservative estimates place the number of deaths at over 10,000 nationwide. Some historians believe the real number was far higher, as many deaths were misattributed to illness or never properly investigated. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia were hit especially hard. In New York City alone, hundreds died in a single year from poisoned alcohol, and thousands were hospitalized. The federal government never issued a mass warning campaign. There were no nationwide alerts saying, "Alcohol has been poisoned and will kill you." To do so would have been to admit responsibility. Instead, officials issued vague statements blaming bootleggers, even though the poisons originated in federally mandated formulas. The government framed itself as a bystander rather than the source. This episode exposes a fundamental truth about Prohibition. It was enforced not just through law, but through coercion and sacrifice. The state made a conscious decision that some lives were expendable in service of a moral ideal. This logic echoes uncomfortably through history. When governments decide that deterrence justifies death, the line between law enforcement and violence disappears. The poisoning program also reveals deep class and racial biases. Immigrant neighborhoods and poor communities suffered the most. Wealthier Americans had doctors who could prescribe medicinal alcohol or connections to safer sources. The policy effectively created a two-tier system of survival. The law claimed to be universal, but its consequences were not. By the late 1920s, public opinion began to turn decisively against Prohibition. The violence of organized crime, widespread corruption, and mounting evidence of government overreach eroded support. The poisoned alcohol deaths became part of a broader realization that the policy was not just ineffective, but cruel. When Prohibition was repealed in 1933, the federal government quietly abandoned the poisoning program without apology or accountability. No official ever faced criminal charges for authorizing the poisoning. No families received compensation. The victims were absorbed into statistics, footnotes, and forgotten headlines. The narrative of Prohibition moved on, focusing on speakeasies, gangsters, and cultural rebellion, while the dead were left behind. Today, this episode is rarely taught in schools. Prohibition is often framed as a misguided but well-intentioned social experiment, a quirky chapter in American history. The reality is far more disturbing. It was a moment when the government chose to weaponize public health against its own people, valuing obedience over life. The story challenges comforting assumptions about democratic governance. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about power, morality, and accountability. How far can a government go to enforce a law? At what point does deterrence become murder? And how easily can victims be dismissed when they are labeled as lawbreakers? The poisoned alcohol of prohibition is not just a historical curiosity. It is a warning. It shows how moral certainty, combined with fear and frustration, can lead to policies that cross ethical lines with chilling ease, all while being justified as necessary, legal, and even virtuous. The people who died during this period did not die accidentally. They were not collateral damage of ignorance. They were casualties of a deliberate strategy. Remembering them means refusing to accept sanitized versions of history that turn tragedy into trivia. It means acknowledging that even in a nation built on ideals of liberty, the state has at times been willing to kill to enforce morality. That is the part of prohibition most textbooks leave out. For many Americans, the idea that women once could not open a bank account without a husband sounds like something pulled from the 1800s, a relic of corsets and horse-drawn carriages. But this reality exists. Well into the lifetimes of people still alive today. Until the 1970s, banks across the United States routinely denied women the basic financial autonomy to open a checking account, apply for a credit card, or receive a loan without a male CO signer, usually a husband or father. This was not an informal social custom or a fringe practice. It was a deeply entrenched system, reinforced by law, custom, and institutional policy, and it shaped nearly every aspect of women's lives in modern America. For much of U.S. history, the legal doctrine of coverture defined a married woman's existence. Under this system, a woman's legal identity was absorbed into that of her husband. She could not independently own property, enter contracts, or control her earnings. While reforms in the 19th century began to loosen these restrictions, the cultural and financial consequences of coverture lingered far longer than most people realize. Even as women gained the right to vote in 1920, financial independence remained largely out of reach. Banks operated on the assumption that men were the primary earners and decision-makers, while women were dependents whose economic lives revolved around marriage. This assumption was not questioned for decades. A woman could be employed, educated, and financially responsible, yet still be treated as a legal risk simply because of her gender. Lenders routinely argued that women were more likely to quit jobs, become pregnant, or rely on husbands for support, making them unstable borrowers. These stereotypes were presented as neutral risk assessments rather than what they were: discrimination dressed up as financial prudence. Single women faced particular obstacles. Even those with steady incomes and strong savings were often denied accounts or credit outright. Divorced women, widows, and separated women frequently found themselves suddenly locked out of financial systems they had relied on while married. Many were shocked to learn that accounts they believed were jointly owned were legally controlled by their husbands. When marriages ended, whether through death or divorce, women were often left scrambling to establish credit histories from scratch, sometimes in middle age. Credit cards, which became widespread in the 1950s and 1960s, intensified these inequalities. Banks commonly issued cards in a husband's name and provided wives with secondary cards that offered no independent credit history. Even when women applied using their own income, lenders discounted or ignored their earnings. Some banks literally cut a woman's reported income in half or more when calculating creditworthiness, assuming she would eventually stop working. Others required a male guarantor regardless of income level. This system trapped countless women in dangerous or unhappy marriages. Financial dependence was not just inconvenient, it was coercive. A woman who could not open a bank account or access credit could not easily leave an abusive relationship, rent an apartment, or support herself and her children. Economic dependence reinforced social expectations of female obedience and endurance. The message was clear. Independence was risky, marriage was safety, and autonomy was optional. What makes this history especially unsettling is how recent it is. In the early 1970s, millions of women were working, paying taxes, and contributing to the economy. Yet were still legally treated as financial minors. This was happening during the same era as the civil rights movement, the moon landing, and the Vietnam War. America was presenting itself as a modern, forward-looking nation, while half its population remained financially constrained by gender. The turning point came through sustained activism, legal challenges, and changing economic realities. Feminist groups, consumer advocates, and civil rights lawyers began to document discriminatory lending practices and challenge them publicly. Women testified before Congress about being denied loans, credit cards, and mortgages despite strong qualifications. Their stories revealed a systemic problem that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. A critical milestone arrived with the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. This legislation made it illegal for creditors to discriminate based on sex or marital status, among other factors. For the first time, women were legally entitled to apply for credit in their own names and have their income evaluated fairly. The law also prohibited lenders from requiring a husband's signature unless the husband was directly involved in the account. The impact was immediate, but uneven. Laws do not erase attitudes overnight. Many banks resisted, delayed compliance, or quietly found loopholes. Some women continued to face obstacles well into the late 1970s and early 1980s. Others were unaware that their rights had changed at all. Still, the act marked a fundamental shift in how financial institutions were allowed to treat women. Legal progress was reinforced by court decisions that challenged gender discrimination more broadly. Why? Figures like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who argued landmark gender equality cases before joining the Supreme Court, helped dismantle the legal logic that treated women as dependents by default. These cases reframed discrimination as a constitutional issue, rather than a matter of tradition or convenience. The long-term effects of decades of financial exclusion did not disappear with new laws. Credit histories, wealth accumulation, and property ownership are cumulative. Women who spent years unable to build credit entered the new era at a disadvantage. This contributed to persistent gender wealth gaps that remain visible today. Even now, women on average have lower retirement savings and less accumulated wealth than men, a legacy tied in part to years of restricted financial access. This history also reshapes how we understand modern debates about financial independence, marriage, and gender roles. The idea that women should just leave bad situations ignores how recently financial systems were designed to prevent exactly that. The structures that limited women's choices were not ancient. They were embedded in living memory, shaping families, careers, and life trajectories. Perhaps most troubling is how normalized this discrimination once was. Bank managers did not see themselves as villains. They believed they were enforcing common sense. Many women internalized these rules, accepting them as inevitable rather than unjust. When discrimination is systemic, it often becomes invisible, not because it isn't harmful, but because it is everywhere. The story of women in banking in America is not just about money. It is about autonomy, dignity, and control over one's life. A bank account is more than a place to store cash. It is a gateway to independence, the ability to earn, save, plan, and leave. Denying that access denies freedom in practical, everyday ways. Looking back, it is tempting to assume progress is permanent. But this history serves as a reminder that rights can be delayed, denied, and defended under the guise of normalcy. The fact that women gained financial autonomy so recently should provoke reflection, not complacency. It should challenge the idea that inequality is always obvious or loudly contested. Sometimes it is quiet, bureaucratic, and enforced with a polite smile across a bank counter. When people say, "That wasn't that long ago," they are exactly right. It wasn't. The women who stood in bank lobbies in the 1960s and early 1970s, told they needed a husband's permission to manage their own money, are still here. Their experiences are not distant history. They are modern American history, and they deserve to be remembered, not as curiosities, but as proof of how easily inequality can hide inside everyday systems. Understanding this past is essential not to dwell in outrage, but to recognize how freedom is constructed in real terms. Rights are not only written in constitutions, they are enforced or denied at desks, counters, and offices. The ability of women to open a bank account without a husband is not a trivial milestone. It is a reminder that equality, when it arrives, often does so far later than we like to admit, and only because people insisted on being treated as full citizens in their own time. During the Cold War, fear shaped policy in ways that are still difficult to fully comprehend. The United States believed it was locked in an existential struggle against communism, one in which losing was unthinkable. Nuclear weapons were not the only concern. Intelligence agencies feared that enemies had discovered ways to control the human mind, methods that could turn soldiers into traitors, prisoners into spies, or citizens into weapons. In this atmosphere of paranoia, secrecy, and urgency, the U.S. government crossed a line that few Americans realize was ever crossed. Through the Central Intelligence Agency, the federal government secretly experimented with mind control techniques, including powerful psychoactive drugs like LSD, on thousands of people, many of them American citizens, without their knowledge or consent. The roots of these experiments trace back to the early Cold War years, when reports began circulating that Soviet and Chinese forces were using brainwashing techniques on prisoners of war. American soldiers captured during the Korean War sometimes returned making pro-communist statements, fueling fears that the enemy had found a way to override free will itself. Whether these fears were exaggerated or misunderstood mattered less than how seriously they were taken. Intelligence officials believed the human mind had become a new battlefield, and they were determined not to fall behind. In 1953, the CIA formally launched a top-secret program known as MK-Ultra. Its stated goal was to research methods of mind control, interrogation, and psychological manipulation. In practice, it became one of the most ethically disturbing programs in American history. MK-Ultra encompassed more than 150 sub-projects and involved universities, hospitals, prisons, military bases, and research institutions across the country. Many of the researchers involved did not even know they were working for the CIA. Others knew and chose not to ask questions. At the center of MK-Ultra was the belief that chemicals could unlock, erase, or reprogram the human mind. LSD, a powerful hallucinogen discovered in the late 1930s, became a primary focus. The drug was relatively new, poorly understood, and extraordinarily potent. Researchers believed it might be used to break down psychological defenses, induce confessions, alter behavior, or even wipe memories clean. Instead of conducting controlled ethical studies, the CIA authorized widespread testing on unwitting subjects. The people who were drugged were not volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were prisoners, psychiatric patients, soldiers, students, sex workers, immigrants, and ordinary civilians. Some were given LSD without warning and observed as they panicked, hallucinated, or lost touch with reality. Others were dosed repeatedly over weeks or months. In some cases, subjects were not even told they were part of an experiment at all. One particularly disturbing aspect of MKUltra involved safe houses in cities like San Francisco and New York. The CIA rented apartments and used sex workers to lure men inside. Without their knowledge, the men were slipped LSD in drinks while CIA operatives watched through one-way mirrors. These operations, euphemistically called Operation Midnight Climax, treated human beings as disposable tools for observation. There was no medical oversight, no informed consent, and no concern for long-term psychological damage. The consequences were often severe. LSD can trigger intense anxiety, paranoia, psychosis, and long-lasting mental health issues, especially when administered without preparation or support. Some subjects experienced breakdowns that lasted for months or years. Others were institutionalized. At least one man, a civilian scientist named Frank Olson, died after being secretly dosed with LSD during a CIA retreat. Olson suffered a psychological crisis and later fell or was pushed from a hotel window. For decades, his death was ruled a suicide. Only years later did his family learn he had been unknowingly drugged by the government. What makes these experiments especially disturbing is how casually human suffering was dismissed. Internal CIA documents described subjects as expendable. The guiding assumption was that national security justified almost anything. Ethical concerns were seen as obstacles rather than safeguards. Even after the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi doctors were prosecuted for non-consensual human experimentation, U.S. officials convinced themselves that their actions were different, necessary, and defensible. The secrecy surrounding MKUltra was extreme. Many records were deliberately destroyed in the early 1970s, on orders from CIA leadership, as public scrutiny began to increase. What we know today is only a fraction of what actually happened. The surviving documents reveal a pattern of recklessness and moral blindness, but they also hint at experiments far more extensive than the official record admits. The program began to unravel in the mid-1970s, when congressional investigations into intelligence abuses were launched in the wake of Watergate. The Church Committee, a U.S. Senate investigation, exposed MKUltra to the public for the first time. Americans were shocked to learn that their own government had secretly drugged its citizens in the name of national security. Testimony revealed how little oversight existed and how easily power had been abused. Even then, accountability was limited. No senior CIA officials were criminally prosecuted for their roles in MKUltra. Some victims received modest settlements, often without full acknowledgement of what had been done to them. Many never learned the truth at all. The government issued apologies, but apologies do not undo trauma, lost years, or lives permanently altered. The cultural impact of these revelations was profound. Public trust in government institutions eroded further, reinforcing the growing skepticism of authority that defined the late 20th century. MKUltra became a symbol of how fear can corrode democratic values from within. It also fueled conspiracy theories, some grounded in fact, others exaggerated. Because the reality was already so disturbing that disbelief felt safer than acceptance. The ethical failures of MKUltra raise questions that still matter today. How much power should intelligence agencies have? Who watches the watchers? And how easily can extraordinary circumstances be used to justify extraordinary cruelty? The people who approved these experiments were not monsters in their own minds. They were officials convinced that the ends justified the means, that secrecy excused brutality, and that some lives were acceptable losses. It is also important to understand who bore the greatest risks. Vulnerable populations, those with less power, fewer resources, and limited ability to refuse, were targeted most often. Prisoners, mental health patients, and marginalized communities were seen as convenient test subjects. This pattern mirrors other dark chapters in American medical history, where the vulnerable paid the price for progress that primarily benefited the powerful. The legacy of MK continues to shape ethical standards in research and intelligence work. Institutional review boards, informed consent requirements, and stricter oversight exist in part because of these abuses. Yet safeguards are only as strong as the willingness to enforce them. History shows that when fear dominates, rules can be bent, ignored, or erased. What is perhaps most unsettling is how long it took for the truth to emerge. For decades, victims were dismissed as delusional or unreliable when they tried to speak about what happened to them. The idea that the government would secretly drug its own citizens sounded too extreme to be credible. In reality, it was documented policy. The story of CIA mind control experiments is not just about LSD or Cold War paranoia. It is about power without accountability, secrecy without restraint, and science stripped of ethics. It is about how easily democratic ideals can be compromised when leaders convince themselves that survival requires abandoning principle. This history forces a reckoning with comforting assumptions about government benevolence. It challenges the belief that abuses only happen elsewhere, under dictatorships or enemy regimes. MK happened in the United States, funded by taxpayers, justified by fear, and hidden behind classification stamps. Remembering this episode is not about dwelling on the past for shock value. It is about understanding how fragile trust really is, and how essential transparency and accountability are to any free society. The people who were drugged without consent were not enemies. They were Americans. And what happened to them stands as a stark reminder that the greatest threats to freedom sometimes come not from outside, but from within. For much of American history, the forced assimilation of Native American children was not an accident, a misunderstanding, or a side effect of expansion. It was a deliberate policy, openly discussed, federally funded, and aggressively enforced. Beginning in the late 19th century and continuing well into the 20th, Native American children were taken, often by force, from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to erase who they were. Their languages were forbidden, their hair was cut, their names were replaced, their spiritual beliefs were punished. The goal was not education as Native communities understood it, but transformation, to strip indigenous children of their identity and remake them into something the U.S. government considered acceptable. The philosophy behind these schools was bluntly stated by Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the most famous of these institutions. Pratt's motto, repeated without shame, was "Kill the Indian, save the man." He did not mean this metaphorically in a gentle sense. He believed Native cultures were inferior, dangerous, and incompatible with American society. Children, he argued, were the most effective targets for assimilation because they could be reshaped before their identities were fully formed. The federal government embraced this logic. Through agencies that later became part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Native families were pressured, coerced, or outright forced to send their children away. In many cases, soldiers or government agents arrived at reservations and took children without parental consent. Parents who resisted risked losing food rations, facing imprisonment, or suffering other punishments. Children as young as 5 were put on trains and sent hundreds or even thousands of miles away, often never seeing their families again for years. Upon arrival at these schools, the transformation began immediately. Children's traditional clothing was confiscated and replaced with military-style uniforms. Long hair, which held deep cultural and spiritual significance in many tribes, was cut short. This alone was traumatic, symbolizing mourning or disgrace in some cultures. Children were assigned English names, sometimes randomly, sometimes mockingly. Their original names, names tied to ancestry, land, and meaning, were erased with a roll call. Language was one of the primary targets. Speaking native languages was strictly forbidden. Children caught using their mother tongue were beaten, isolated, forced to wash their mouths with soap, or subjected to other humiliations. The intent was clear. Language carried culture, memory, and worldview. Destroy the language, and the culture would wither. Many children became afraid to speak at all, retreating into silence rather than risk punishment. Education in these schools was not designed to empower native children intellectually. Academic instruction was minimal. Instead, boys were trained for manual labor, farming, carpentry, blacksmithing, while girls were taught domestic work like sewing, laundry, and cleaning. The goal was to prepare them for low-wage labor in white households and industries, reinforcing a racial hierarchy under the guise of civilization. Conditions in the schools were often brutal. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, inadequate nutrition, and harsh discipline were common. Disease spread rapidly. Tuberculosis, influenza, and measles killed thousands of children. Death rates at some schools were staggering. When children died, families were not always notified. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves far from home. Parents who came looking for their children sometimes discovered years later that they had already died, alone and forgotten by the institutions that claimed to be saving them. The psychological trauma was immense. Children were taught to hate their own identities. They were told their families were backward, their traditions sinful, their communities savage. Many internalized shame that followed them into adulthood. When they eventually returned home, if they returned at all, they often felt alienated. They could no longer speak their language fluently. They struggled to reconnect with cultural practices they had been punished for. They belonged fully neither to white society nor to their own communities. This rupture was not accidental, it was the point. Boarding show. OLs were a tool of cultural genocide. While the term may sound extreme, it accurately reflects intent and impact. The United Nations defines cultural genocide as the destruction of institutions, languages, and traditions of a people. That is exactly what these schools were designed to do. They targeted children because children represented continuity. Break that chain, and the culture weakens. What makes this history especially painful is how long it persisted. The peak of the boarding school era was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but many schools remained open into the 1960s and even the 1970s. This is not distant history. Survivors are still alive. Their children and grandchildren live with the consequences. The trauma did not end when the schools closed. Generations of Native families experienced disrupted parenting, loss of language, and unresolved grief. Children who grew up in institutions often lacked models of healthy family life, having been raised under authoritarian punitive systems. This contributed to cycles of abuse, addiction, and mental health struggles, problems later used to stereotype Native communities without acknowledging their root causes. For decades, this story was minimized or ignored in mainstream education. Boarding schools were sometimes described as benevolent efforts to educate indigenous children, framed as well-intentioned but flawed. Rarely were Native voices centered. Rarely were the experiences of children, the fear, loneliness, punishment, and loss, fully acknowledged. In recent years, that silence has begun to crack. Survivors have spoken publicly about their experiences, often at great emotional cost. Communities have worked to reclaim languages nearly lost. Researchers have uncovered burial sites at former boarding schools, confirming what Native families had long said. Thousands of children never came home. Each discovery has reopened wounds, but it has also forced a broader reckoning. The legacy of boarding schools complicates simplistic narratives about American progress. It reveals that violence does not always come with guns and chains. Sometimes it comes with classrooms, uniforms, and the language of improvement. The cruelty lies not only in physical abuse, but in systematic erasure, the slow stripping away of identity until a child no longer recognizes themselves. Understanding this history matters because its effects are ongoing. Language revitalization programs, cultural education, and community healing efforts are acts of survival and resistance. They are attempts to rebuild what was deliberately broken. When Native communities fight to preserve or revive their languages, they are not clinging to the past, they are repairing damage inflicted by policy. This history also demands honesty from institutions that benefited from these systems. Churches, universities, and government agencies played roles in operating or supporting boarding schools. Accountability has been limited. Apologies, when they come, often arrive generations late and without material repair. The forced boarding school system stands as one of the clearest examples of how the U.S. government sought to solve what it called the Indian problem. Instead of honoring treaties, respecting sovereignty, or coexisting with indigenous nations, it chose eradication through assimilation. Children paid the price. When people say, "Why don't native cultures just move on?" they ignore the fact that moving on requires something to move on from. When languages are beaten out of children, when names are replaced, when families are torn apart, recovery is not automatic. It takes generations, if it happens at all. The truth is uncomfortable, and that discomfort is necessary. The story of Native American boarding schools is not a footnote. It is a central chapter in American history, one that reveals how power can be used to destroy under the banner of progress, and how resilience can survive even the most systematic attempts at erasure. The children who endured these schools were not lost causes to be fixed. They were nations in human form, and despite everything done to erase them, their cultures are still here. Not because of these schools, but in spite of them. In the early 20th century, at a time when racial segregation and violence defined much of American life, there existed a place that stood as a powerful contradiction to the myth that black success was impossible in the United States. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood District, often called Black Wall Street, was one of the wealthiest black communities in the nation. It was a place built by black hands, financed by black dollars, and sustained by black ambition. Within a single night and the following day in 1921, it was nearly erased from the map through one of the deadliest episodes of racial violence in American history. What followed was not only physical destruction, but decades of silence so deep that generations of Americans grew up never hearing its name. Greenwood was not an accident. It emerged in the shadow of Jim Crow laws that barred black Americans from white-owned businesses, neighborhoods, and institutions. Shut out of opportunity, black residents in Tulsa created their own. Greenwood boasted banks, hotels, grocery stores, theaters, newspapers, schools, doctors' offices, and law firms. Money circulated within the community, building wealth that was rarely seen among black Americans at the time. Homes were well kept. Children were educated. Business owners employed neighbors. It was not just prosperous, it was self-sustaining. This prosperity made Greenwood visible, and visibility made it a target. In a nation built on white supremacy, the existence of a wealthy, confident black community was seen by many white Americans not as evidence of progress, but as a threat. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, fueled by jealousy, racism, and a belief that black success violated the natural order of society. The spark that ignited the violence was a flimsy accusation. In May 1921, a young black man named Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a white woman in an elevator. The evidence was weak, and many historians believe the incident was either exaggerated or entirely fabricated. But facts mattered little. Local newspapers ran inflammatory headlines, including suggestions of lynching. Rumors spread quickly. Within hours, white mobs gathered, armed and angry. Black residents of Greenwood understood the danger immediately. Lynchings were common in America at the time, and Tulsa was no exception, determined to protect Rowland and prevent another extrajudicial killing. a group of armed black men went to the courthouse to offer assistance to local authorities. Their presence, intended as a protective measure, was interpreted as an act of aggression. Tensions escalated. Shots were fired. What followed was not a riot in any meaningful sense of the word. It was an organized assault. Over the next 18 hours, white mobs descended on Greenwood. Homes and businesses were looted and set ablaze. Entire blocks burned to the ground. Witnesses later described airplanes flying overhead, dropping incendiary devices and shooting at residents below, an almost unimaginable image of domestic aerial violence against civilians. Black men, women, and children fled as flames consumed their community. Some were shot on sight. Others were rounded up and detained in makeshift camps. Local law enforcement did not stop the violence. In many cases, they participated in it. Black residents were disarmed, arrested, and imprisoned, while white attackers were deputized and encouraged. Firefighters who attempted to extinguish the flames were reportedly threatened at gunpoint and forced to stand down. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 1,200 homes were destroyed, along with churches, schools, and businesses that represented decades of labor and sacrifice. The death toll remains uncertain. Official counts listed around 36 fatalities, but survivors and historians believe the true number was far higher, possibly as many as 300. Many bodies were buried in unmarked graves. Families never received confirmation of what happened to loved ones. Records were lost, destroyed, or never created. The absence of precise numbers became another layer of erasure. In the aftermath, Greenwood lay in ruins. Survivors faced unimaginable loss. Entire life savings vanished overnight. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, citing riot clauses that conveniently absolved them of responsibility. The city of Tulsa did not rebuild Greenwood. Instead, officials considered rezoning the land to prevent black residents from returning. Only through determined legal resistance did survivors manage to reclaim their property. Even then, rebuilding was slow and painful. Many residents lived in tents through harsh winters. Others left Tulsa altogether, forced into poverty by the destruction of their livelihoods. Greenwood was eventually rebuilt, but it never fully recovered the wealth that was stolen from it. Generational prosperity, homes, businesses, inheritance, had been wiped out in less than a day. Perhaps the most chilling part of the Tulsa Race Massacre was what happened next: silence. For decades, the massacre was omitted from history books, classrooms, and public discourse. Survivors were discouraged from speaking about it. Some were threatened. Others carried trauma too heavy to articulate. Tulsa's white leadership had every incentive to forget. Acknowledgement would have meant accountability. Children grew up in Tulsa without learning what had happened in their own city. Teachers were not taught. Textbooks did not mention it. Local newspapers avoided it. The story survived only in whispered family memories, passed down cautiously, if at all. An entire chapter of American history was buried, not because it was unknown, but because it was inconvenient. This erasure mattered as much as the violence itself. When a nation refuses to remember, it refuses to learn. The destruction of Greenwood was not an isolated anomaly. It was part of a broader pattern of racial terror that included lynchings, pogroms, and the systematic suppression of black advancement across the United States. But without memory, patterns disappear. In their place, myths flourish. Myths about equal opportunity, meritocracy, and the inevitability of racial inequality. It was not until the late 20th century that serious efforts were made to uncover the truth. Survivors, now elderly, began to speak publicly. Historians pushed for investigations. In 1997, the state of Oklahoma finally convened a commission to study the massacre. Its findings confirmed what Black Tulsans had always known. The violence was real, it was devastating, and it was enabled by local authorities. Yet even after official acknowledgement, justice remained elusive. Recommendations for reparations were largely ignored. No one was prosecuted. The economic damage was never repaired. Memorials and museums began to appear, but remembrance without restitution felt incomplete to many descendants of survivors. The legacy of the Tulsa Race Massacre extends far beyond Tulsa itself. It exposes how racial violence was used not just to punish, but to prevent black success. Greenwood was destroyed because it contradicted white supremacist beliefs. Its wealth was not merely burned, it was stolen, redistributed, and erased from the historical ledger. Understanding this history reshapes how we talk about racial wealth gaps today. Wealth is not only built, it is also taken. Greenwood's destruction wiped out millions of dollars in black-owned assets at a time when accumulation was already extraordinarily difficult. That loss reverberated across generations. Children who might have inherited businesses inherited trauma instead. The massacre also challenges the language we use, calling it a riot. Shifts blame onto the victims, implying chaos rather than targeted violence. In reality, it was a massacre, one-sided, racialized, and enabled by power. Language matters because it shapes memory, and memory shapes accountability. In recent years, the story of Greenwood has finally begun to enter mainstream awareness. Schools have started teaching it. Mass grave investigations have renewed public attention. Descendants continue to demand recognition and repair. The silence has been broken, but the echoes remain. The destruction of Greenwood was not just an attack on buildings. It was an attack on possibility. The idea that Black Americans could build something enduring, prosperous, and independent. That is why it had to be destroyed, and why it had to be forgotten. Remembering the Tulsa Race Massacre is not about reopening old wounds. The wounds never closed. It is about telling the truth that was deliberately buried. It is about acknowledging that one of the wealthiest Black communities in America was not lost to time or failure, but taken by violence, and then erased by silence. History does not disappear when it is ignored. It waits. And Greenwood's story, once buried under ashes and lies, has waited long enough. In the shadow of World War II and the dawn of the atomic age, the United States entered a period of intense scientific ambition mixed with profound fear. Nuclear weapons had changed the balance of global power overnight, and government officials believed that understanding radiation, how it affected the human body, how much exposure could be tolerated, and how it could be measured, was a matter of national survival. What followed was not just laboratory research or animal testing, but a series of secret human radiation experiments conducted on Americans themselves, many of whom were sick, poor, institutionalized, or otherwise unable to refuse. These experiments were carried out largely during the 1940s and 1950s, often without consent, without disclosure, and without regard for long-term consequences. At the center of this effort was the post-war expansion of nuclear research overseen by agencies such as the United States Atomic Energy Commission. Created in 1946, the commission was tasked with controlling nuclear materials, advancing atomic science, and maintaining U.S. superiority in a rapidly escalating Cold War. Radiation was both a tool and a threat, and officials believed they needed real human data to understand its effects. Animal studies were deemed insufficient. Computer modeling did not yet exist. Human bodies became, in practice, test instruments. The people selected for these experiments were rarely informed participants. Many were hospital patients being treated for unrelated illnesses, including cancer, heart disease, or mental health conditions. Others were prisoners, soldiers, or residents of institutions for the disabled. Some were pregnant women, some were children. What united many of them was vulnerability. They depended on the very institutions that subjected them to experimentation. They trusted doctors. They trusted the government. That trust was exploited. In some experiments, patients were injected with radioactive substances such as plutonium without their knowledge. Plutonium, one of the most toxic elements known, had been produced in large quantities during the Manhattan Project. Scientists wanted to know how it moved through the human body, where it accumulated, and how quickly it was excreted. To find out, doctors secretly injected hospitalized patients with trace but dangerous amounts of plutonium and then monitored them for years, collecting urine, blood, and tissue samples. The patients were told nothing. Some were terminally ill, but others were not. At least one subject lived for decades after the injection, never knowing what had been done to him. These experiments were not isolated. Across the country, researchers exposed people to radiation in various forms. Some cancer patients received radiation doses far higher than what was considered therapeutic, not to treat them, but to study radiation tolerance. In other cases, individuals were deliberately fed radioactive substances in food or drink to observe absorption rates. Pregnant women at certain hospitals were given radioactive iron or iodine to study how radiation crossed the placenta, without being told of the risks to themselves or their unborn children. Our children were not spared. At institutions for the mentally disabled, researchers conducted feeding experiments in which children were given cereal laced with radioactive isotopes. The stated goal was to study nutrient absorption. Parents were often told their children were participating in harmless nutrition studies. The word radiation was omitted. Consent forms, when they existed at all, were vague and misleading. BR prisoners were another frequent target. In some cases, inmates were exposed to radiation in exchange for reduced sentences or small payments. The power imbalance was extreme. Consent obtained under such conditions was not truly voluntary, but it was recorded as such. Researchers justified these experiments by claiming they offered prisoners a way to contribute to science and national defense. Military personnel were also used. Soldiers were exposed to radiation during nuclear weapons tests, sometimes ordered to march toward blast sites shortly after detonations. While these tests were often described as training exercises, their real purpose included studying the effects of radiation exposure on human bodies. Many veterans later suffered from cancers and chronic illnesses they believed were linked to these exposures. For decades, their claims were denied or minimized. What makes these experiments particularly disturbing is that they occurred after the horrors of Nazi medical experimentation had been exposed to the world. The Nuremberg trials led to the creation of the Nuremberg Code, which explicitly stated that voluntary informed consent is essential for ethical human experimentation. American officials were aware of these principles. Some had helped prosecute Nazi doctors, yet they convinced themselves that their own actions were different, necessary, controlled, and justified by national security. Secrecy was paramount. Many experiments were classified, their records hidden behind layers of bureaucratic protection. Even doctors conducting the experiments were sometimes told only part of the truth. Hospital administrators were pressured to cooperate. Funding flowed quietly. Oversight was minimal or non-existent. The ethical review boards that are standard today did not exist, and internal objections were often ignored or silenced. The consequences for the subjects were often devastating. Radiation exposure can cause cancers, organ damage, genetic mutations, and chronic pain. Some subjects experienced severe illness shortly after exposure. Others developed conditions years later, never connecting their suffering to the experiments they had unknowingly endured. Families were left without answers. Death certificates did not mention radiation. Medical records were incomplete or classified. For decades, the public knew nothing about these programs. The experiments remained buried in archives, known only to a small circle of scientists and officials. It was not until the 1970s and 1990s, amid broader investigations into government misconduct, that the truth began to emerge. Journalists uncovered documents, whistleblowers spoke out, survivors and families demanded answers. In 1994, President Bill Clinton ordered a comprehensive review of human radiation experiments conducted by the federal government. The findings confirmed what many had long suspected: thousands of Americans had been subjected to radiation experiments without informed consent. The government issued a formal apology. Some compensation programs were established, though many victims had already died, and payments were often limited and difficult to obtain. The apology, while significant, could not undo the damage. Many families learned for the first time that their loved ones had been used as test subjects. Trust in medical institutions and government agencies was deeply shaken, especially in communities that had already experienced exploitation. The experiments reinforced a painful truth: when secrecy and power go unchecked, even democratic governments can commit profound ethical violations. This history challenges comforting narratives about scientific progress. Advances in medicine and technology often come with hidden costs, and those costs are not always shared equally. In the case of human radiation experiments, the burden fell disproportionately on the poor, the sick, the institutionalized, and the marginalized. Their suffering was treated as acceptable collateral in the pursuit of knowledge. The legacy of these experiments still shapes modern research ethics. Informed consent, institutional review boards, and strict oversight requirements exist in part because of these abuses. They are reminders written into policy, born from real harm. But safeguards are only as strong as the commitment to uphold them, and history shows how easily fear and ambition can erode moral boundaries. Remembering these experiments is uncomfortable, and that discomfort is necessary. It forces a reckoning with the idea that good intentions or national security can excuse the violation of human dignity. It asks us to consider who benefits from progress and who pays the price. It also reminds us that victims are not abstract numbers. They were people with names, families, and futures that were altered without their permission. The story of secret human radiation experiments is not just about the past. It is a warning about the present and the future. When governments operate in secrecy, when science advances faster than ethics, and when vulnerable populations are treated as means rather than ends, the risk of abuse returns. These experiments happened not in some distant authoritarian state, but in the United States, during a period often remembered as a golden age of progress and prosperity. That contradiction is precisely why the story matters. Progress without accountability is not progress at all, and history that is forgotten is history that waits to repeat itself. For many Americans, segregation is still imagined as a Southern problem. Jim Crow signs, separate water fountains, and schoolhouse doors slammed shut below the Mason-Dixon line. The North, in this popular story, stands as the moral counterweight, imperfect perhaps, but fundamentally more tolerant, more just, and less openly racist. This narrative is comforting, and it is wrong. Segregation in the United States was not confined to the South. Northern cities enforced racial separation just as effectively, though often through quieter, more bureaucratic means. Instead of explicit Jim Crow laws, segregation in the North was built through housing policy, banking practices, school zoning, employment discrimination, and local government decisions that shape daily life with ruthless efficiency. In northern cities like Chicago, New York, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and Boston, Black Americans were not legally barred from white spaces in the same blunt way they were in Mississippi or Alabama, but they were systematically boxed in, priced out, excluded, and denied opportunity through mechanisms that appeared race-neutral on paper while producing deeply racialized outcomes in reality. The result was segregation that was just as real, just as damaging, and in many ways more enduring because it was easier to deny. Housing was the foundation of Northern segregation. Where you lived determined where you went to school, what services you received, what jobs were nearby, and how much wealth you could build. In the early 20th century, as millions of Black Americans migrated north during the Great Migration to escape Southern terror and seek industrial jobs, they encountered a different but equally rigid racial order. White residents, real estate developers, and city officials moved quickly to contain Black newcomers within tightly defined neighborhoods. One of the most powerful tools used to enforce this containment was the racially restrictive covenant. These were clauses written into property deeds that explicitly prohibited the sale or rental of homes to non-white buyers. Entire neighborhoods were legally designated as white only, sometimes for decades. These covenants were not fringe practices. They were widespread, openly enforced, and upheld by courts for years. Homeowners associations used them aggressively, and real estate boards promoted them as a way to protect property values. Even after the Supreme Court ruled in 1948 that racially restrictive covenants could not be enforced by courts, the damage had already been done. Neighborhoods were racially mapped. Wealth had been accumulated by white families through homeownership, while Black families were locked out. And informal enforcement, harassment, intimidation, and violence continued to keep lines intact. Banks played a crucial role in maintaining this system. Through a practice later known as redlining, financial institutions systematically denied mortgages and loans to Black neighborhoods and Black applicants, regardless of income or creditworthiness. Maps were drawn marking areas deemed hazardous for investment, almost always based on racial composition rather than actual economic conditions. A Black family with a stable job and savings could be denied a home loan in a white neighborhood, while a white family with fewer resources could be approved. Redlining was not accidental or unofficial. It was reinforced by federal policy through agencies like the Federal Housing Administration, which promoted discriminatory lending standards and subsidized suburban development, almost exclusively for white Americans. Post-World War II housing booms created massive wealth for white families through low-interest, government-backed mortgages. Black families were largely excluded from this opportunity, not by choice but by design. The effects were devastating and long-lasting. Home ownership is the single largest source of wealth for most American families. By denying Black Americans access to mortgages in growing neighborhoods, Northern segregation robbed generations of the ability to build equity, pass down assets, and achieve financial stability. The racial wealth gap did not emerge naturally, it was engineered. Schools reflected and reinforced housing segregation. Because public schools were funded locally and drew students from neighborhood zones, segregated housing produced segregated schools. Northern school districts often claimed innocence, arguing that segregation was simply the result of residential patterns. But those patterns were the outcome of deliberate policy choices. When Black families attempted to move into white neighborhoods, they were met with zoning restrictions, denial of permits, or outright hostility. School boundaries were frequently drawn and redrawn to maintain racial separation. Black students were assigned to overcrowded, underfunded schools, while nearby white schools had better facilities, smaller class sizes, and more resources. When Black parents challenged these inequalities, they were often dismissed or accused of causing trouble. Integration was framed as disruptive rather than unjust. In cities like Chicago, officials went so far as to build public housing projects almost exclusively in Black neighborhoods, concentrating poverty while preserving white areas. High-rise housing developments were marketed as solutions but functioned as containment zones. Meanwhile, White families fled to suburbs. Suburbs made possible by federal subsidies and highways that cut directly through black communities, destroying homes and businesses in the process. Employment discrimination further reinforced segregation. Black workers in northern cities were often confined to the lowest-paying, most dangerous jobs, regardless of skill or experience. Unions frequently excluded black workers or segregated them into separate locals with fewer protections. Employers used informal hiring networks that favored white applicants, keeping workplaces racially stratified. Policing and law enforcement added another layer. Black neighborhoods were over-policed and underprotected. White neighborhoods benefited from public investment and infrastructure, while black areas were neglected, then blamed for the consequences of that neglect. When unrest erupted, as it did in cities across the North during the mid-20th century, it was portrayed as evidence of black dysfunction rather than a response to systemic exclusion. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of Northern segregation was denial. Because it lacked the explicit signage of Southern Jim Crow, many white Northerners insisted segregation was not their problem. They viewed racism as something that happened elsewhere. This denial made reform harder. It allowed discriminatory systems to persist under the guise of neutrality, tradition, or market forces. The civil rights movement exposed these realities, but progress was uneven. Landmark laws like the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act outlawed explicit discrimination, yet enforcement was weak and resistance fierce. White backlash in northern cities was intense. Busing, integration efforts, and affordable housing initiatives were met with protests, lawsuits, and political obstruction. The legacy of northern segregation is still visible today. Cities remain deeply divided by race and income. School districts are segregated. Wealth gaps persist. Neighborhoods shaped by redlining decades ago continue to experience underinvestment, environmental hazards, and limited access to opportunity. These are not accidents of history, they are consequences of policy. Understanding this history challenges comforting myths about American progress. It reveals that segregation was not just a Southern aberration, but a national system maintained through law, finance, and local governance. It also reframes modern debates about inequality. When people ask why disparities still exist, the answer lies not in individual failure but in collective decisions made over generations. Northern segregation teaches a crucial lesson. Injustice does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind paperwork, policies, and polite language. Sometimes it operates through banks instead of batons, zoning boards instead of mobs. And because it is easier to deny, it can be harder to dismantle. Remembering this history is not about assigning guilt to individuals long gone. It is about recognizing responsibility, acknowledging that the landscapes we inhabit were shaped by choices and that those choices favored some while excluding others. Only by facing that truth can the promise of equality move beyond myth and begin to approach reality. The American flag is often presented as a fixed, sacred object, a unifying symbol that has always commanded universal respect. In popular memory, it stands for freedom, unity, and sacrifice, untouched by controversy. But the real history of the flag is far more turbulent. From the nation's earliest years, the American flag has inspired rebellion, protest, and dissent just as often as it has inspired loyalty. Long before flag burning was defended as protected speech, people who used the flag to criticize the government were arrested, beaten, and jailed. The symbol of freedom was paradoxically used to punish those who exercised it. In the early United States, the flag was not yet the untouchable icon it would later become. It was a relatively new symbol, tied closely to revolution and defiance. The first American flags emerged from rebellion against British rule. They were raised not to celebrate authority, but to reject it. Colonists flew flags that mocked the British crown, depicted rattlesnakes, or bore slogans threatening resistance. To the British, these flags were not patriotic expressions. They were acts of sedition. Displaying them could bring violent consequences. That rebellious origin did not disappear when independence was won. Throughout the 19th century, Americans used the flag in deeply political ways. Abolitionists, labor organizers, women's rights activists, and Antifa. Our protesters all claimed the flag as their own, insisting that their dissent represented the truest form of patriotism. At the same time, authorities increasingly worked to control how the flag could be used, especially when its display challenged power. By the late 1800s, as the United States industrialized and inequality grew, the flag became a contested symbol in labor struggles. Workers waved it during strikes to assert that their demands for fair wages and safe conditions were American demands, not foreign threats. Employers and government officials responded by reframing dissent as unpatriotic. When protests turned confrontational, the same flag that flew over government buildings was invoked to justify crackdowns. The idea that disrespecting the flag was a crime took hold during this period. States began passing laws banning flag desecration, vague statutes that criminalized acts deemed insulting to the flag. These laws were not neutral. They were often enforced selectively, targeting radicals, socialists, anarchists, and labor activists. Burning, defacing, or altering the flag was treated not as political expression, but as moral deviance and criminal behavior. World War I dramatically escalated this tension. As the United States entered the war, patriotism was weaponized. The flag became a loyalty test. To question the war was to insult the nation itself. Under sweeping laws like the Espionage Act, dissenters were arrested for speech alone. Flag burning, flag alteration, or even refusing to salute the flag could result in jail time. Immigrants, particularly those from Germany or Eastern Europe, were especially vulnerable. Mob violence was common, and people were beaten or killed for failing to display the flag prominently enough. During this period, protesters who used the flag ironically or critically were treated as enemies. Socialist rallies were raided. Anti-war demonstrators were imprisoned. Newspapers encouraged citizens to report neighbors who did not show sufficient reverence. The flag, once a symbol of rebellion against tyranny, had become a tool for enforcing conformity. This pattern repeated itself during World War II and the early Cold War. As fears of communism spread, the flag was positioned as the ultimate marker of American identity. To challenge government policy was increasingly framed as an attack on the nation itself. Flag-burning laws were strengthened, public schools required flag salutes, and students who refused, often for religious or moral reasons, were punished or expelled. For much of the 20th century, courts upheld these restrictions. Burning the flag was considered conduct, not speech, and therefore punishable. Protesters were arrested, fined, and jailed. Some lost jobs or were blacklisted. The message was clear: the flag symbolized the state, and criticizing it crossed a line. The civil rights movement exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of this logic. Black Americans were expected to revere a flag that flew over segregated schools, discriminatory laws, and violent repression. Many activists insisted that their protests honored the Constitution more than blind obedience ever could. Some used the flag deliberately in demonstrations to highlight this contradiction, wearing it, altering it, or displaying it upside down to signal distress. During the Vietnam War, flag burning became a powerful symbol of opposition. Images of protesters setting fire to the flag shocked the public and enraged politicians. For many Americans, the act felt like a betrayal of soldiers fighting overseas. For protesters, it was a visual shorthand for moral outrage at government actions carried out in the nation's name. Arrests were common. Protesters were beaten by police, sentenced to jail, and branded traitors. What is often forgotten is that the Constitution did not suddenly change to protect flag burning. Rather, the understanding of free speech slowly evolved. Courts began to recognize that political expression does not lose protection simply because it is offensive. The same logic that once justified jailing protesters was increasingly seen as incompatible with democratic principles. Even so, the backlash was fierce. Politicians repeatedly attempted to ban flag burning through constitutional amendments. Veterans groups and conservative organizations argued that the flag deserved special protection. Protesters countered that the flag represents freedom precisely because it can be criticized. The debate revealed a deep divide in how Americans understood patriotism, as obedience versus accountability. The irony runs deep. The flag that inspired rebellion against British authority became a symbol used to suppress rebellion at home. Early protesters were jailed not because their actions caused harm, but because they challenged the emotional power of a national symbol. The state did not fear the burning cloth, it feared what the act communicated. Looking back, it becomes clear that flag burning was never really about the flag. It was about power, control, and who gets to define the me. Aiming of patriotism. Those in authority insisted that love of country meant reverence for symbols. Dissenters argued that love of country meant holding it to its ideals. This tension has never fully disappeared. Even today, flag burning provokes outrage disproportionate to the act itself. Calls to criminalize it resurface regularly, often during periods of political unrest. The instinct to punish symbolic dissent remains strong, especially when people feel threatened or uncertain. The long history of jailing flag burners exposes a contradiction at the heart of American identity. A nation founded on rebellion struggles to tolerate it. A symbol meant to represent freedom is repeatedly used to limit it. And yet, the very persistence of protest suggests that dissent is as American as the flag itself. When early protesters were jailed for burning the flag, they were not rejecting freedom, they were exercising it. Their punishment reveals how fragile liberty can be when symbols are treated as sacred objects, rather than reminders of shared responsibility. The American flag has inspired revolutions, rebellions, and resistance, not because it demands obedience, but because it represents ideals that people are willing to fight over. That conflict is not a flaw in the nation's history. It is part of its meaning. Throughout the 20th century, the United States presented itself to the world as the global champion of democracy. American presidents spoke passionately about freedom, self-determination, and the right of people to choose their own leaders. These ideals were woven into speeches, textbooks, and foreign policy rhetoric. Yet behind the scenes, a far more contradictory reality unfolded. Time and again, U.S. presidents approved covert and overt actions that helped overthrow democratically elected governments abroad, replacing them with regimes more friendly to American political or economic interests. This pattern created a deep tension between America's words and its actions, a tension that continues to shape global distrust of U.S. foreign policy today. The roots of this contradiction lie in the early Cold War, when American leaders became convinced that any government perceived as left-leaning posed an existential threat. Communism was not merely an ideology to be debated, it was treated as a contagious disease that had to be contained at all costs. Presidents were told by advisors and intelligence agencies that allowing even mildly socialist governments to succeed would encourage others to follow. Democracy, in this worldview, mattered less than alignment. One of the earliest and clearest examples came in Iran in 1953. Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, had been democratically elected and enjoyed broad public support. His major offense, in the eyes of Washington and London, was nationalizing Iran's oil industry, which had been dominated by British interests. U.S. officials feared this move would inspire similar actions across the developing world and possibly push Iran closer to the Soviet Union. Under the administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Central Intelligence Agency coordinated a covert operation that destabilized Mossadegh's government through propaganda, bribery, and orchestrated unrest. The coup succeeded, removing a democratically elected leader and reinstalling the Shah as an authoritarian ruler. Publicly, the United States continued to praise freedom. Privately, it celebrated the removal of an inconvenient democracy. Just 1 year later, a similar pattern played out in Guatemala. President Jacobo Arbenz was elected on a reform platform that included land redistribution aimed at reducing extreme inequality. One of the largest landowners affected was a powerful American corporation with close ties to U.S. officials. The Arbenz government was labeled communist, despite operating within democratic norms. Under Eisenhower's approval, the CIA again orchestrated a coup, using psychological warfare, armed proxies, and diplomatic pressure. Arbenz was forced to resign, and Guatemala descended into decades of military rule and civil war. The elected government was gone, but American leaders insisted they had acted to protect freedom. These actions were not isolated mistakes. They reflected a broader doctrine, embraced by multiple presidents. Democracy was acceptable only when it produced the right outcomes. If voters chose leaders who challenged U.S. interests, those choices could be overridden. Presidents rarely acknowledged this openly. Instead, interventions were framed as necessary evils, temporary measures, or defensive acts against tyranny. By the 1960s and 1970s, this logic had hardened. In Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, the United States supported coups, military juntas, and strongmen who promised stability and anti-communism. Presidents were briefed on the likely consequences: torture, disappearances, repression, but approved the actions anyway. Freedom at home was held up as proof of moral superiority, even as it was undermined abroad. Chile offers one of the most striking examples. In 1970, Salvador Allende was elected president in a free and fair election. He pursued socialist policies through democratic means, nationalizing key industries and expanding social programs. His election terrified U.S. officials, who feared it would legitimize democratic socialism in the Western Hemisphere. Under President Richard Nixon, the CIA was authorized to destabilize Allende's government economically and politically. Funding was funneled to opposition groups. Economic pressure was applied. The goal, as recorded in internal documents, was to make the Chilean economy scream. In 1973, a military coup overthrew Allende. He died during the attack on the presidential palace. General Augusto Pinochet took power, ruling through brutal repression, mass arrests, torture, and disappearances. Thousands were killed or imprisoned. Yet the U.S. government quickly recognized the new regime. Public statements emphasized order and stability. The overthrow of an elected government was treated as a regrettable but necessary step. What makes these interventions particularly troubling is not only their brutality, but their hypocrisy. Presidents spoke eloquently about democracy while denying it to others. American citizens were taught that their nation stood apart from old-world imperialism, even as their government manipulated foreign elections, funded coups, and undermined sovereignty. The contradiction was rarely discussed openly, and when it was, critics were often dismissed as naive or unpatriotic. Supporters of these policies argued that the Cold War left no room for idealism. They claimed that the Soviet Union posed such a grave threat that extraordinary measures were justified. But this rationale ignored a fundamental question. If democracy is only respected when it produces favorable outcomes, is it truly valued at all? The coups approved by U.S. presidents did not spread freedom. They often crushed it, leaving long-lasting scars. The human cost was enormous. Countries subjected to coups frequently endured decades of instability, violence, and authoritarian rule. Civil wars erupted. Human rights abuses became routine. Entire generations grew up under regimes installed or supported by foreign interference. These outcomes were not unforeseen. Warnings were issued. Reports documented abuses. Presidents and their advisors chose to proceed anyway. At home, Americans were rarely told the full story. Covert operations were hidden behind classification. Media coverage was limited or framed through an anti-communist lens. The image of the United States as a benevolent force remained largely intact. Only later, through declassified documents and investigative journalism, did the extent of these interventions become clear. The pattern extended beyond Latin America and the Middle East. In Africa and Asia, elected leaders were undermined if they pursued non-aligned or socialist paths. In some cases, the U.S. directly backed coups. In others, it provided funding, intelligence, or diplomatic cover. Presidents signed off on these actions with the belief that they were safeguarding global order, even as they dismantled democratic institutions. This history complicates modern discussions about American leadership. When U.S. officials call for democracy abroad, many countries remember a different record, one of interference, manipulation, and selective morality. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. The legacy of these coups fuels skepticism toward American intentions, particularly in regions that suffered the consequences. It also challenges the idea that American foreign policy failures were merely the result of bad intelligence or isolated misjudgments. The consistency of these actions across administrations suggests a systemic problem. Presidents of different parties approved similar interventions. The language changed, but the underlying logic remained. U.S. interests took precedence over other nations' democratic choices. Understanding this history does not require rejecting the values of freedom and democracy. On the contrary, it requires taking them seriously enough to confront where they were betrayed. The men and women who voted in Iran, Guatemala, Chile, and elsewhere believed they were exercising a fundamental right. That right was overridden not by their own people, but by a foreign power that claimed to stand for liberty. The contradiction between promoting freedom at home and undermining it abroad is not just a historical footnote. It continues to shape global politics and American credibility. A nation cannot indefinitely preach democracy while practicing interventionism without consequence. The echoes of those coups are still heard in distrust, resentment, and resistance. Presidents who approved these actions may have believed they were acting in the national interest. Some may have felt trapped by the logic of the colonel. War. But intentions do not erase outcomes. Democracies were destroyed. Lives were lost. The promise of self-determination was denied. This history forces an uncomfortable reckoning. It asks whether democracy is a principle or a tool. It challenges citizens to look beyond speeches and examine actions. And it reminds us that the true measure of commitment to freedom is not how loudly it is proclaimed at home, but how consistently it is respected abroad.